With all the rain and flooding we have, some are asking, what can we do to protect ourselves? The answer may be in how farmers get their crops into the ground. Plus, the state says there's no link between groundwater contamination in Haysville and cancer rates. Residents aren't so sure. And 2 years of extra money still not enough to get Kansas's budget back on track? Some say no. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. This is Kansas Week, and I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. Despite ending this fiscal year with almost $1 billion in reserves, Kansas budget problems aren't completely in the past. Kansas's nonpartisan legislative research staff says at current rates, Kansas will spend more than it collects in taxes and fees this next fiscal year. That begins July 1st, and in following years. After a major tax overhaul brought more money into the state, lawmakers this last year tried to make up for budget cuts over the last decade. But legislative research says if lawmakers don't raise taxes or cut spending, they're facing a return to budget shortfalls, allotments, and cuts. According to the Associated Press, the most optimistic prediction shows a small shortfall developing in 2023. While tax collections have exceeded expectations for the last 2 years, building up the current surplus, the Department of Revenue says it expects the economy to slow in 2020 or 2021. And that is not news most Kansans wanted to hear. Joining me on the desk this week to discuss this and other topics, we have State Representative Nick Haysville from Wichita, Republican.
Good to be here.
We have Dion Leffler from the Wichita Eagle and State Representative Jim Ward, Democrat from Wichita. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the budget, lots of high hopes as I was covering the legislature this year that we had kind of solved the problems that Kansas has been dealing with. Now it sounds like maybe not so much. Where do we go from here? Jim, I'm going to start with you because you've got more time in the state legislature, I think.
First of all, I think that the numbers for the last 2 years shows that the repeal of the Brownback tax experiment was an enormously successful action. We've had 23 out of 24 months where we've raised more money than we've spent. And we have $1 billion, almost $1 billion in the bank. Also, the second part, which is where the problem comes in, our state was devastated for 5 years. And we have to make reinvestments, primarily in schools, as we had a court decision last week saying we finally, for the first time in 10 years, have gotten in line with what the needs of children are. Long term, we always have to adjust the budget. And for me, the first 2 years of a budget projection I take as pretty strong. When you get out 3, 4, and 5 years, who knows are we at war? How is the trade war going or the tariff war? You know, there's too many variables to control the budget. So I think the takeaway is the budget's in a good place now and we've solved some critical issues and we'll have to continue to monitor it with fiscal responsibility.
Nick?
I agree with Representative Ward. The budget is in a good place now. But as projections show, in a few short years, we'll be broke again. We have to get control of spending. We have to rein in spending. We can't tax our way to prosperity. We've seen the Supreme Court rule on school funding. They've said it's adequate. That's a good first step. Now we need to take a look at the rest of our budget, see where we can rein in spending, see where perhaps we're underfunding this program, overfunding this program. We can shift some money around. But we have to start thinking long term instead of kicking the can down the road.
Okay, so as I'm listening to Jim and Nick here, Dion, I'm kind of hearing what you and I have been covering for the last several years, this dichotomy between do we cut services to make the budget match or do we raise taxes? And really, nobody's happy with either one.
Well, wait a minute, I just want to throw in, it's not raise taxes, it's stop cutting or creating loopholes. We got to stop that addiction. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. I mean, this is the first year, I think, on record that the state budget hasn't been a complete disaster as,
Certainly since I've been covering politics in Kansas.
Me too, that's, so there's something to be said for that. I mean, you are in a better position now than you have been. And I think probably that the answer lies somewhere between him and him.
So with you?
Yeah, maybe some judicious cutting and maybe some judicious taxing, and we might get it through this thing.
Well, and I know the governor certainly made a point, and some of the line item vetoes that she had made in the budget when it passed were for this. She wanted a larger ending surplus to protect against what her advisors said was an oncoming recession.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, maybe there is some room for movement on the issue of the federal tax and delinking that from the state taxes, so we can get some of our deductions back. But I mean, it's there's enough money now, and I mean, let's be happy with that.
The second one, John says, the Kansas economy, with the exception of the ag sector, which we'll talk about later, is really doing pretty well now. Our unemployment's at 3.5%. Yeah. The state budget's fully paid for. We didn't do any tricks. We didn't borrow from capers. We didn't do any of the smoke and mirrors of the Brownback years. And we're sitting on $1 billion in the bank as a cushion. So yes, maybe in 4 years the world will look a whole lot different. We'll have to take, but remember the projections say 4 years from now, in 2023, we may have problems. Okay, I think we have time between now and then. We should enjoy the fact that right now the economy is really in a good place.
I'd like to point out that there are still some smoke and mirrors with the governor's budget because we're still robbing from KDOT. As far as the tax reform decoupling from the federal government, yeah, we should start looking at that. And the economy is doing well. I think one of the people we can thank for that is the president and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and we need to fully fill that down here in Kansas. And that's why decoupling from the federal government is so important.
Well, we're going to leave it right there. The budget is a point of nonstop contention in this state. We're not going to solve it here and now. No. We do have some other things to discuss today. Disbelief. That's how some people in Haysville are reacting to a state health department study that shows no link between decades of groundwater contamination and an increase in cancer cases. KSN's Tiffany Lane explains.
What we did is we drew that concentration line.
State health officials told the crowd Tuesday night their study tried to track down all the cases of cancer and birth defects reported from the Haysville area, where dry cleaning chemicals tainted the well water for almost 20 years. They concluded that the rate of disease was actually lower than expected.
So looking at those target cancers, that the rates that we found for the area of interest were actually lower, statistically significantly lower than the rate for the county and the region and the state as well.
But some residents believe the study did not take everyone into account.
It was interesting to me that the cancer incidences they used only counted after 2004. Yeah. I realize it can take a while for cancer to happen, but if the dumping started in '78, that's a long time.
The state health department also announced plans to demolish the old dry cleaners building soon and will begin cleaning the contaminated soil. All homes in the affected area are already hooked to city water lines.
We still have well water for water in the yard, water in the garden, and playing in the sprinklers.
And certainly clean water is something we have come to regard as a right amongst Americans. This is a concern. This is not the only area. There's also areas in southwest Wichita, if I remember correctly, that have some of these same concerns. Are lawmakers looking at perhaps making some changes and dealing with situations like this, Nick?
I think that's where we're going to go with this. I do have in my district in West Wichita some contamination of groundwater. I think we need to start looking at the 1995 Kansas Dry Cleaner Environmental Response Act. There's some restrictions in there that are put on KDHE that I think may be overbearing. We need to allow KDHE to go out, test this groundwater on historic sites, search for new sites, and be more proactive.
Okay.
One of the things that, I mean, I've seen this over and over in my reporting career, is it's almost impossible to prove that a cancer cluster is caused by some environmental factor. If it's not below the expected level, whatever that is, then it's above it, and they say, well, but it's within the realm of possibilities, it's within the realm of probabilities. So, I mean, when you look at, I cut my teeth on this issue out in Burbank, California, where you had Lockheed and other aircraft companies pouring thousands and thousands and thousands of gallons of stuff on the ground. And while they couldn't directly link it, at least they cleaned it up. you know, or at least they're cleaning it up. It's still going on, but you know, they cleaned it up, and you know, everybody was happier. So, you know, maybe we spend a little too much time in this state worrying about what caused something, and not enough time worrying about how to get it done.
Yeah, how to get it cleaned up.
We in Wichita have a long history with this problem. We were one of the first cities that had a huge groundwater problem underneath our downtown area, underneath the old Coleman plant. We came up with, and the late Chris Churches came up with a really brilliant idea on how to focus, first of all, clean it up. Second of all, find out who's responsible and try to get money back for the cleanup. And third is to find out what, if any, causes are long term. I think that's the same plan the state should be, which clean it up. In Hutchinson, they have a very creative way that they've dealt with a similar kind of groundwater pollution problem. For what KDHE said, I'm not a big believer in coincidence. You dump poison in the water that people use and you see more cancer. But I'll let the lawyers and the courts sort out the causation. What I think the most important as a government official is that we clean up these sites so that the economy can continue to grow, that we get the people who put the poisons in to begin with to make their fair share contribution, and then let the lawyers and courts decide who's.
I think Jim makes a good point. One of the problems with the 95 Kansas Dry Cleaner Environmental Response Act is there's a $5,000 cap on dry cleaners. There's a $5,000 cap on cleanup costs that we can charge these dry cleaners. So that is something I believe the legislator needs to review, and I look forward to getting to work next year and taking a look.
Well, certainly as we're talking about clean groundwater, getting into drinking water and all those sorts of sources, flooding this year has been a major problem. And from rising prices at the grocery store to extra long commutes and your tax dollars spent repairing damaged roads, all of it causing a headache for Kansans this year. But I spoke with scientists who say there is a way to at least mitigate the damage, and it starts on the farm. I explained how in this report I filed with Cake News. 2019 got off to a wet start. Heavy snows over the winter, heavy rains this spring.
Everybody took it on the chin this year.
Farmers watched, unable to get their equipment back into soaked fields. Kansas has seen it before, when a change in weather patterns in the 1930s caused the Dust Bowl.
The dust storms and those things, you know, I mean, that's kind of opposite problem, but it's all related.
Scientists say from dust storms caused by extreme drought to this year's flooding, it all comes back to the soil.
Soil acts as kind of a living sponge, and so it takes in and filters out any contaminants.
Candy Thomas is a soil health specialist with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. She spends much of her time traveling the Midwest, teaching farmers how to get that healthy soil.
Now watch what happens when it rains. Hard.
This video from the Union of Concerned Scientists shows just how differently healthy soil reacts to heavy rains compared with unhealthy soils.
The amount of water that isn't absorbed can run off, flood nearby communities.
Something she says may not completely prevent flooding like this year's, but would certainly make it less disastrous.
We were able to start holding more water when these heavy rains would come.
Darren Williams is talking about no-till farming. It involves 4 basic steps. 1, minimize disturbance of the soil. That means no plowing or tilling between crops.
Maintaining the soil structure and keeping it in place are real critical things.
2, keep the ground covered and protects the soil from both the baking and drying effects of the sun and wind.
It's hard on top, but if we move over here to the residue, look how easy that goes in the ground.
Then 3, start working on what's in the soil, the nutrients used to feed crops, by rotating what you plant. What one crop takes out of the soil, the next one puts back in. And finally 4, add the animals back into the system, from those that live in the soil,
So they're living the good life here.
to those that live on the soil, providing a natural fertilizing effect. No-till farmers generally enter the process one step at a time, but Williams went all in.
We saw an immediate difference early on, you know, even in the first year.
Now he's profiting from that decision. While his neighbors are still repairing flood damage to their fields, he's already planting.
Well, you're standing in a field right here that took on 5 inches of rain in an hour, you know, 2 weeks ago, and we're planting it.
But few farmers are as ready to make these changes as Williams was.
Better for the farmer's bottom line.
Yep.
Better for the general public.
Yeah.
How many Kansas farmers would you say are participating in this sort of farming?
Not as many as I would like, obviously.
While we were unable to find a vocal, organized opposition to the no-till movement, many Kansas farmers appear unwilling to give up methods they know work to gamble on something new.
You would think after the 30s, when we had drifts of soil equivalent to snow, not have that happen again, but we still have dust clouds.
I just can't see how using less chemical and fertilizer and making more money per acre is a bad thing.
And that's really what it comes down to, is we all want to be economically sound. Certainly, as you alluded to earlier, Jim, the agricultural industry in Kansas has been struggling over the last several years. Darren Williams said that he is making more money. He spends less putting the crops in, getting the crops to grow, and he has more crop to sell because of this process. At the same time, you've got less flooding coming off of his fields because the water is staying soaked into the ground there. Now, I remember when I was out covering the tornadoes by Lawrence and Linwood, and the governor came out and toured. And one of the things that she said at that time is that she is working on ways to help prevent some of these disasters from happening again, because we were talking about all of the disasters the state has been facing so far this year, just a lot of them. And I have to ask, is this one of the ways that we do that? Somehow finding a way to provide governmental support to encourage farmers to take this method, use this method that might perhaps mean less flooding. It's not going to mean no flooding, but maybe less. Nick?
Yeah, I think what you saw from that video there, how much science precision actually goes into farming. It's an amazing process. I will say this in the spirit of bipartisanship. The governor's response to these flooding, to these natural disasters has been adequate. She's done a great job with this. We in the House passed H.R. 5015, which is a disaster declaration. The governor sent it to the president. I believe today the president signed it, which allows us to get federal funding for disaster relief in Kansas. So I'm very grateful for that.
Jim?
Having spent some time in the West in the last couple of years, I'm amazed that people still farm. The challenges facing the men and women who go out on the ground and try to make a living. And this is just another example. I think that this is something we should encourage, yes. I don't think it's a silver bullet that this will solve, but I think more and more people, and I think farmers are on the cutting edge of how best to use their soil, how best to preserve their soil, and there are some that are having difficult time transitioning from the old ways to the new ways, whether it be this kind of farming versus the no irrigation kind of farming. The biggest obstacle, there's two obstacles to farmers today if you talk to them. One is uncertainty of trade policy and the tariffs, and the second thing is the weather. We can't control that. And this is a perfect example, but just, in 2012, I remember standing out at Cheney where you could walk out in the cove, 100 yards past the dock because we're in the middle of a drought. And so there's a lot of things that, and the last comment I would have is the vast majority, 95+% of the incentives come from the federal government in the Farm Acts that we had trouble getting through, but they finally got earlier this year. That's where those kinds of incentive might play in to try this kind of farming and see how it works.
Well, and that's certainly something the governor can push for through our congressional delegation, right, Diane?
Oh yeah, I guess, I wonder if there's like a big farm, small farm thing going on here too. Whether this might work at this kind of scale of the farmer that you talk to, but maybe not so well when you're talking about huge acreage.
Well, I will say that Candy Thomas, she seemed to think it would work no matter what the acreage. And she goes around training farmers around the Midwest in how to use these methods. The big question is, not everybody's going to be able to go all in immediately like Darren was. Right. A lot of folks kind of scale it in step by step. But Darren said even with just going to no-till, he saw a change right away.
What kind of yield do they get? Is there a change in the amount of...
Yeah, he's getting a higher yield.
Really?
Now, I don't have exact numbers. I couldn't tell you exactly what the percentages are changed, but he said he has a higher yield and he's spending less getting it.
The other thing that I've found that I'm, being a city boy, farming is different in the West than it is in South Central Kansas or in the North. That the kinds of tools they can use in the West are different than they can use down here. And I don't know.
And actually, Candy Thomas did address that that this method is useful for both, because while it helps prevent flooding in eastern Kansas where you get heavier rains, in western Kansas where you have sporadic rains, maybe not as much, it helps the land hold on to that water when it does come, so that you have to do less irrigation, you have to do less pulling from the Ogallala Aquifer and things like that. So she said it has applications at both ends.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we're going to move on because we're running out of time. Despite protests from golfers, the city of Wichita will close Clapp Golf Course after 106 years. The city told me it's about economics. Golfers say something else is up. I took a look in this story I filed with Cake News.
Probably 75% of the people that grew up in Wichita learned how to play golf at Clapp.
But the city says fewer and fewer Wichitans are actually using the golf course. The number of rounds played there dropping 61% since 2011.
This was a tough decision for staff as well. It's nothing that we want to hang our hat on. Anytime we lose an amenity, it's not good for us. But it just was not sustainable.
Which is why Wichita Parks and Recreation suggested closing the golf course and turning the land into a park.
This is probably one of the most difficult things that I've had to tackle in my time on the council.
Councilman James Clendenin says he knows many want at least some golfing options to remain, maybe a driving range, which is why he steered the discussion toward what else could go in place. Suggestions include maybe a new library facility, zip lining, a trampoline park or dog park. Now the city has 3 general plans to formulate one master plan out of. That would include the golf course closing on August 2nd. But golfers feel the city is rushing this decision.
You're going to build a mountain and you're going to create 3 lakes. That's got to be a public expense, and it seems like that probably dwarfs the expenses associated with the golf course.
Okay, so first, those who used to watch the early versions of this show long before I came to Kansas, you'll recognize Dale Goder, former host. Now, in this case, a golfer who wants to keep the golf course going. And everybody at this table, except me, has some sort of connection. Nick, you said you were just playing there. You used to work there.
Yep.
And Diane, you were covering the story along with me this week. And Jim, this is in your district. Yep. So who's going to jump in first?
I'll go ahead. This is a punch to the gut. Clapp is a great golf course. I did used to work there. I've played there, countless times. But I do understand that this is an economic decision. It wasn't making money. It's been in the red for years. I don't know if that's an indictment on the city of Wichita and how they manage their golf courses, or if that's an indictment on just the golf industry as a whole slowing down. But I am anxious to see what new projects they'll have going there that will benefit the community.
The thing that I was disappointed in with this was that we took almost an entire year, that golf course, from the time that the park board voted to close that golf course until now. And this period was supposed to be used for planning what comes next, and it hasn't been. We don't know what's going on out there. Now we've got 3 fairly nebulous plans. They just keep talking about all these pie-in-the-sky ideas that this could go in there, this could go in there, this could go in there. And it really, I think, has done a disservice to this community to take that golf course out of circulation before telling people exactly what you're going to do with that land. Because, one of the things that doesn't show up in the plan but was mentioned at the workshop meeting on this was to turn it into a dog-friendly bar, or at least part of the property, into a dog-friendly bar where people could come and, so all that, to me, marks actually a failure of the government in this. They should have a plan by now, or they should just leave the course alone.
Jim, it's your district.
Yeah, it's a disaster. The city of Wichita has failed Southeast Wichita, and it wasn't just a year. They've been trying to close this golf course for about 10 years. They tried to put a quick trip on, the corner of Oliver and Harry. They have been trying to close it, and it goes back to the decision the city made to invest debt in Auburn Hills and take away money from all the other golf courses in the city to pay for that extravagant course, which is a beautiful course in Auburn Hills. Clapp is built on a floodplain, okay? The argument they say is, well, it costs too much to water. They haven't made the investment in the clubhouse. They haven't made investment in the pros. They haven't made the kind of business decisions that all the golf courses could benefit from. And now you saw them, they tried to sell a golf course. They're closing this one. The ideas they've come up with, a bunch of them sound good, but until we see the dollars spent.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to see in what they come up with. They said it's going to take them about a year to come up with a master plan, so I have a feeling we'll be back here in a year. Meanwhile, moving on, a new twist in the opioid epidemic in western Kansas. Now, deadly fake opioid pills are showing up. KSN's Hunter Funk explains.
Garden City police are warning the public about fake opioid drugs being sold in southwest Kansas. The version on the street right now, very dangerous, they say. Garden City police say the pills are testing positive for fentanyl, a much more potent drug than oxycodone. Those who don't know what they're taking can easily overdose. Right now, Garden City police are seeing a 30% increase in drugs mixed with fentanyl and heroin compared to last year. Police officers posted photos showing the letter M and the number 3 on the pill, looking slightly different on the fake pills, and they're usually a different shade of blue. Officers are urging people with any information about the fake pills to reach out to the Garden City Police Department.
Okay, and real quick, yes, no, Hunter doesn't sound a lot like me. That actually was me. I forgot we had some technical difficulties with her story and had to substitute mine in, so that's on me. But Diane, I'm going to come to you real quick. We don't have a whole lot of time. This is an issue, the opioid epidemic. Is it any surprise that we're starting to see these fake ones when there's so much money to be made off of this?
Well, no, I mean, it's no surprise at all. I mean, there's just an incredible market for these drugs, and you know, if you can get a cheaper ingredient that you can sort of maybe pass off as this, I mean, you know, it kind of goes back to like selling the selling the ditch weed as marijuana. You know, I mean, somebody's going to take advantage of that, but in this case, it is extraordinarily dangerous. It's deadly, and you know, I mean, somebody's got to put a stop to it. You know.
Well, and it sounds like the Garden City Police are certainly being very proactive about that. Let's hope that they get a handle on it quickly. Absolutely. Meanwhile, we are out of time. Nick, Diane, Jim, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you being here. Hope you've enjoyed this conversation. Absolutely. We'd also like to thank our news partners at KSN News, Cake News, and the Wichita Eagle for sharing their materials with us. I hope you have enjoyed our discussions as well. We'd love to continue it online. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV. For now, have a great week.